Welcome to our virtual pedagogy event, a series of online pedagogy panels co-sponsored by AWP and the Creative Writing Studies organization. Today's panel will focus on diversity and inclusion in the creative writing classroom with our panel of experts, Felicia Rose Chavez, Caleb González, and Matthew Celestis. Allow me to introduce them before we move on to our discussion. Felicia Rose Chavez is an award-winning educator with an MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Iowa. She is author of the anti-racist writing workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Classroom, coming out soon, and co-editor of the Breakbeat Poets, Volume 4, Latinx. She has served as program director to Young Chicago Authors and founded Girl Speak, a feminist webzine for high school students. She has taught at the University of New Mexico, the University of Iowa, and at Colorado College, all of which she received numerous outstanding faculty awards from. She is currently Creativity and Innovation Scholar in Residence at Colorado College. Caleb González is a doctoral student and graduate teaching associate at The Ohio State University. Before moving to Ohio, Caleb completed his MFA in creative nonfiction at Colorado State University. There, he completed a collection of essays entitled Departures, Arrivals, and Places in Between, a collection of essays on home and places. He is associate director for the 2021 International Writing Across the Curriculum Conference and serves on the board of the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse and the Creative Writing Studies organization, where he is the co-chair of research. Matthew Celestis is the best-selling author of The 100-Year Flood, an Amazon Best Book of September and Kindle First Pick, an Adoptive Families Best Book of 2015, and a Best Book of the Season at BuzzFeed, Refinery 29, and Gawker, among others. And Disappeared Doppelganger, Disappear, a Best Book of the Year at Thrillist.com. Forthcoming in January is the craft book, Craft in the Real World, which explores alternative models of craft and the writing workshop, especially for marginalized writers. His previous books include I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying, Different Racisms on Stereotypes, The Individual and Asian American Masculinity. Matthew was adopted from Korea. In 2015, BuzzFeed named him one of 32 essential Asian American writers. He is currently assistant professor of English at Coe College. He has a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston and an MFA in fiction from Emerson College. He serves on the editorial boards of Green Mountains Review and Machete and has held editorial positions at Pleiades, The Good Men Project, Gulf Coast, and Redivider. I want to just say before we get started that both Matthew and Felicia's books they're both coming out in January. I've read them both, and this audience is going to want to get their hands on them. That's all I have to say. Pre-order it now if you can. These books are game changers. I really think they're game changers. Okay, getting started. First question. Your work argues for a completely new approach to craft that represents a paradigm shift, I think, in creative writing. What inspired you to take on the Western craft monolith? Felicia, I think you had something you wanted to say to that.
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I got my graduate degree from the University of Iowa's nonfiction writing program, and it was a hard 3-year journey for me. And I left that experience and immediately went into teaching in a college classroom. And it took me a while to really process all that I had experienced there. It took me actually full circle back to the Nonfiction Now conference, where I, years later, crossed paths with many people that I went to graduate school with and folks that had taught me in graduate school in Reykjavik, Iceland, of all places. So I tell this story where I'm standing at the podium to read my 10-minute speech for this panel, and I just start crying. I mean, I'm up there, I had practiced the speech, and I'm sobbing, like uncontrollably sobbing, because I feel like I'm committing some sort of betrayal by saying my story out loud, by sharing it for the first time with the folks in the audience, and you know, in a way with myself. And as a result of that, I finished reading. The audience actually passed around. Someone just brought out a piece of paper and passed it around, and recorded their email addresses. People reached out to me afterward, people of color who were recounting their own toxic workshop experiences, and white allies who said, I don't want to replicate this harm, so what can I do to help? And it was that experience. It took that act of courage on everyone's part to say, we need a different way so that, you know, this doesn't happen again, to inspire me to leave and say, okay, I'm ready and willing to write this book. And it's going to be hard, in that it's part memoir and part pedagogy. It's my personal pedagogy, you know, it's my personal experience, but I need to commit it to the page and confront my own experience so that I can validate for other people that they're not alone, and also work toward change.
Wow, what a powerful story. That's incredible. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. Since its inception, craft has operated under a cover of neutrality. What can we gain from understanding that, on the contrary, craft is always embedded in cultural and political context? Felicia, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that, you know, one of the first steps to engaging with anti-racist work, but especially anti-racist work in the classroom, is recognizing that there's no such thing as neutrality, that there's no such thing as universality or objectivity. And so when we have discussions on craft, often we neglect that we're normalizing the centering of whiteness. And when we actively work to decenter that, you know, white supremacy that just kind of exists as normal in the classroom, we're then opening up our own literacy legacy, you know, and broadening it to include most of the rest of the world. And so I encourage my own students to engage with craft on a classroom by classroom basis. So we don't take for granted that there is this you know, craft monolith that exists that we sort of bow down to and study. Instead, we accept craft terms as abstract concepts, and we engage with them one by one and collectively define what that word means, so that by the time we workshop, everybody has this collective lexicon that we've created, and we're able to speak about one another's work with real precision, and this shared understanding of the art concepts at play.
Thank you. Great. I know, Caleb, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about David Murray's work. He talks about this idea that conversations don't just take place in a neutral, ahistorical realm. And I think that something that we gain from this is that we are talking about power dynamics as well. So it's an opportunity to really think about the power dynamics that are at play when we are looking at craft, or when craft is situated in the workshop, as, you know, apart from a historical context or apart from a cultural context. I mean, there's power dynamics that are at play that are framing that. And, you know, just again, just thinking about David Murray's work, when he talks about this notion that one exercise of power is to keep critiques of the dominant power from ever being noted, or noticed. So it's a way of really bringing that to the forefront and talking about how, like, what are the power dynamics at play when this tradition of craft has always been situated in that way, right? And so there's much to gain from deepening that. There's much to gain from even critiquing that and questioning the histories that have undergirded the ways in which craft has been situated in the creative writing workshop.
Like, the research suggests that neutrality was a political strategy at the University of Iowa workshop to spread what they were calling democratic values of individualism through creative writing, and they were quite successful at both kind of spreading those values across classrooms in America and in hiding them under the guise of neutrality. And I mean, in my book, I talk a lot about audience, and I think it's really important to consider who the audience is in a classroom and amongst these various writers that you usually have in any workshop. And I think one thing that the guise of neutrality does is it flattens all of the audience into white supremacy, right? Or kind of white normality. And I think, we have different purposes and different audiences and different reasons for writing. And we're trying to reach different people. And that is very difficult to do when the workshop thinks of us all as trying to do the same thing and reach the same audience under the same norms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that. Okay. An important consideration in making art is the time to do it. And that's something that's long been the province of the wealthy, dominant class. Matthew, you even talk about in your book the context around Aristotelian theory being the acceptance of a slave class to free their masters to think and create. How much do you think achieving an anti-racist workshop, a new approach to craft, is rebuilding a new social context for creativity that understands the challenges to creation?
Yeah, I think, like, we all come to the classroom with various levels of privilege, and even the time to write, right, is a huge part of that, but also kind of familiarity with the craft terms that we're using. Like, I like what Felicia is saying about trying to come up with terms that the class can use together so that everybody's on the same page. And then I also wonder too, like, they go on from these workshops, right, to other workshops, and they kind of step into the same gap of not, having the same context as other writers might have. And I think it's easy to consider it even like on the level of genre. Like, for example, I have a lot of students who have read a lot of fantasy and science fiction and want to write that. And, and then there are other students who are kind of more steeped in workshop culture and literary fiction. And if we talk only in kind of terms of literary fiction, then of course there's a gap there already that other writers are trying to make up for. It needs to be addressed before we can kind of all be on the same page. So I think this, is applicable to all kinds of different levels of privilege and power. And, the workshop, the great thing about workshop is there's all these very different voices and experiences and desires for, literature. And the difficulty then is trying to kind of help everyone to kind of be able to enter the same space at the same, like, kind of context level, or to build up the context so that everybody's able to access the conversation in a more equitable way.
It's interesting too what you're saying. I think too, Felicia, that when you talk about your workshop and the check-ins, that seems to me like a great way to show that we all have different challenges when we're trying to write and come together, and we have different things we're trying to do when we write, and you know, and just the check-in of like, well, what's been going on with you, that, you know, how has your writing been going, and how has maybe it not been going, you know, and understanding that we all have those challenges. So yeah, absolutely. And that we all have different purposes, and as you said, Matthew, different audiences. So I'm excited to talk about this next question because I've been thinking about it for a long time, and it's been discussed for a while anyway, kind of underground, but your books both bring it out. A major tenet of workshop pedagogy is the gag rule, or the silencing of the author during the workshop. Let's talk about what you think the origins of that rule are, how it disenfranchises many students, and what you think some better alternatives might be. Felicia, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, talk about privilege, right? We have the opportunity to silence ourselves so that we experience what it's like to live in the quote unquote real world, right? And I argue that our writers of color are nowhere else but firmly planted in the real world. I just did a facilitation yesterday with a group of MFA faculty who, you know, one person raised his hand and said, don't we do a disservice by allowing students to lead who have never experienced that? He was using a lot of coded language to imply that students of color, in not having past opportunities to exercise voice, might perhaps fumble and fail if they were to lead their own workshop experiences. And my reply was that it worked in both ways, right? We're working daily to advocate for the use of voice and empowering our students to exercise voice and claim their own identities, mentors, artistic preferences. And we're also training in how to listen. And so those who have in the past dominated the conversation are asked to sit back and listen to sideline narratives without any without any intent for an opening of the conversation for their opinion or response, instead to just sit in the silence and really receive another's words. I truly believe that silence is this tool to maintain domination and control in the classroom. A lot of times as educators, we don't realize it as such. Those words seem incredibly harsh when we consider our own, inherent teaching biases, of which all of us bring to the classroom. I believe that we're preventing our artists, and especially our young writers of color, from succeeding on their own terms through the use of silence, in order to imply that our own aesthetic preferences take priority over their own vision for their work. So I think ultimately that gag rule serves as a right of erasure for our students of color, and it serves to reinstate white supremacy.
Caleb, thank you. Caleb, I know you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so I'm a bilingual writer. I incorporate Spanish into my writing, and so just thinking about the way in which the workshop and silencing the author, I mean, how that works in positioning the writer as someone who is to be kept silent, right? Listen, take notes as according to what everybody else is saying about their language, right? And so especially when you have or when there are bilingual writers who are incorporating different languages, different literacies in their stories, and are presenting that to the creative writing workshop, just thinking about what the dynamics that are at play there, right? People are talking about italicizing, right? Should the writer italicize or not, right? And then when the writer is kept silent and not able to add to that, I mean, there's a power control at play there. And I think that that's one way that it works to disenfranchise writers of color, multilingual writers, in particular, who are who are centering not just one language but two languages in their essay. And also, I mean, I appreciate Matthew's comments on audience too, and thinking about different purposes that the writer might have for their story, right? Not the assumptions that can arise when a piece is presented to the workshop as if that is the audience for that piece. There's something to be noted there about language.
Matthew, do you want to add to that?
I can say too, I have this like pet theory that it probably makes a strange sort of sense to think like if you have 12 white male writers of like a similar class background, religious background, etc., probably all straight, able, cis men in the classroom, who experience a great deal of privilege like outside of the classroom and whose voices have always kind of mattered within the system, that silencing one of them might be a way, right? Like if I think of like why you would do that in the first place, I can think maybe this is a place where somebody is able to experience silence in a way that they aren't usually able to. But obviously, like the workshops have changed a lot from the 1930s. And I think I would agree with everything everyone's saying. I also think like we're just thinking on the same level of like what use the workshop is. I think it's like wasting the workshop to silence the writer and to not like the writer talk about their process. I actually think like, what's the point of workshop? It's like to be able to look at this stuff in process and to talk about the author's process, and like the more context you can have for that, the better, I think. So like, it starts with kind of hearing the author's thoughts way before workshop and continuing talking about process after the workshop. The silence is not kind of only in the workshop. And then also thinking about like how, I think another not advantage, but reason for thinking about the difference between an all white male, upper middle class Christian, background, etc., workshop where everybody kind of has similar amounts of privilege, versus a workshop that exists nowadays, is that a lot of the writers now kind of have to face the same kind of silence after they walk out of the classroom and before they walk into the classroom. And it's just kind of like adding to the amount of disempowerment where the workshop could be a place to really work in a different way from how silence works in the real world.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, I love that pet theory, by the way. I can see it. It seems like it's kind of a way of like, let's cut down on mansplaining. But anyway, yeah, and I think it does get a lot to what you're all saying, which about workshop. About audience too, because how can you talk about audience if the author's not involved? Okay, along the same vein, this is kind of the flip side of that. Writing is often about the desire to be heard. How do you think the workshop can be reimagined, as Felicia describes it, a pedagogy of deep listening? Felicia, do you want to start?
Yeah, this is my favorite. I mean, it's like at the heart of my own workshop, where, we meet daily, and we have this opportunity at Colorado College on the block plan to meet daily. But I've also done this on the semester system, and it's just such a beautiful offering. Every time we get together, as you mentioned, we do check in, and I go around to every single person and I ask them by name, "How are you?" And they respond at first with like, "I'm good, I'm fine," awkward, uncomfortable. And then it grows until the point where if I accidentally miss that day, someone will email me and say, "Well, this is what I was going to say for check-in." Like they're preparing, right? And it's this community building that happens from day one. People give of themselves, but they learn each other's names just like that. And then we're able to address each other by name, and we free write daily. and the work isn't ready, it's raw, it's messy, and they stand up. If they're, this is a very ableist kind of language, they stand up, they sit up, and they read it aloud. And everyone goes around and they read, and they're apologizing, and they're stammering, and they're nervous. And I know it's time to transition from the daily free writing exercises when people stop apologizing for their work. And they're able to just say, what's at the heart of this? Like, what do you see that I'm, unable to see because I'm preoccupied with aesthetics, which is the way it looks or the way it sounds. And we give of each other in this really generous way. As part of this process, this daily process, we're preparing for this formal workshop in which the writer reads their own work aloud on the spot. No one takes it home and studies it. And we listen collectively. And then the artist moderates the workshop according to an adapted kind of Liz Lerman methodology, which I believe, Matthew, you also reference in your book. And so we're enabling the writer to lead the conversation, but we've prepared them in advance so that they're able to take on that leadership role. I think two things happen as a result of this. One is that as writers, we learn to listen to ourselves. We're listening to the psychological and emotional relationship to writing. And we're listening to our own intuition and our own mentors. So that's kind of where the listening comes in. But we're also training in how to listen to others. As I said earlier, we're listening to narratives that maybe we haven't encountered before. And we're listening without that appeal for our opinion. Instead, we're training into how to ask questions and really learn from one another.
Yeah, and I would think, that would have effect societally. Yeah. I know, Caleb, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think about the traditions of storytelling and the orality that is often tied to that. And so just thinking about Felicia, what you were saying about the community aspect, that's so important, I think. I also think about the way in which the dominant narrative has often been situated in this notion of like a one-sided conversation. When really a conversation, the conversation of the workshop, it's not one-sided. And so in thinking about what it means to bring the sense of deep listening into the classroom and into the workshop, I think that it's really important to think about how that conversation is situated, right? When we're thinking about craft through just one lens, one dominant lens that has sort of gone unexamined, right? Under theorized, under studied, right? It provides for this idea of a one-sided conversation that just goes to implementing a framework for students to just see craft in one way, where I think that there's more to that. There's more to a conversation that is not just one-sided, but that goes both ways, right? And that the aspect of listening is really important. It's important because we're able to learn about our own work, as Felicia, as you were saying, we're able to also learn about what creative writing can be apart from the dominant narrative that has often surrounded the ways in which it's been taught.
Felicia, you want to add to that?
Well, I just like how we left it talking about like what that can offer us outside of the classroom, as Caleb kind of was leading into. It's not this contained experience. We think like, oh, this creative writing classroom is a class that you can take and get a grade on and move on. But when you're really training people in how to listen to one another, the implications, as you said, are tremendous. In that, I'm thinking back to this workshop that I just taught this fall, and 3 of my first year students, there was 15 of them, they did not self-select into my workshop. They were planted in there as one of those first-year writing classes. They were all like econ and computer science people. They were like so mad at me at the beginning, like, I am not creative. Don't make me do this. And when they left, they weren't evaluating themselves based on how they learned to write an essay or an intro or a conclusion or whatever it may be, the skills of craft. They were analyzing their growth based on their personal relationship to process and writing, claiming the identity of the author, saying it's the first time they had freedom, the first time they felt like they owned their words on the page. But most important to me is that 3 out of those 15 independently said that they learned empathy as a result of this creative writing class. And to me, that just blew my mind, because I was like, that's the word. Excuse me, that's the word. And that's the word that I think should motivate us forward. Absolutely. In that the more that we listen and exchange with one another, the more we're learning the skill of empathy, and we can play that out for the rest of our lives, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll just say really briefly, this always reminds me, I had an intro class in fall 2016, an intro creative writing class, and they were a very talkative class. And the day after the election, some students were extremely upset and had a lot of personal experience and reasons why. And so I let them talk about it. And the other students in the class who had kind of really hadn't given that much thought to why it really even mattered who won, were hearing these stories. And they were saying, oh my gosh, wow, I never thought of that. I never realized that. And it was so, I just realized how we are in our silos. We just don't really hear and listen to other people, and that the creative writing class can be such a place where that happens. Okay, I'm sorry. I should move on and not talk so much myself. What are some of the most influential books or writers who have informed your ideas of pedagogy and the workshop or craft in general? I know, Caleb, you had something you wanted to say about that, but I'm interested to hear what you all have to say.
Yeah, right now I'm reading an edited collection on culturally sustaining pedagogies, edited by H. Samuel Leem and Django Paris. And they talk about culturally sustaining pedagogies as a way to foster and sustain linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of schooling and the social transformation that occurs within spaces of learning. And as I'm reading that book, I am thinking about the creative writing workshop and the assumptions that arise about writers and writers of color in particular under these frameworks of deficit, right? That when writers enter the space, there is a literary tradition that they need to learn, a literary tradition that is taught over and over again in the workshop space. And so what culturally sustaining pedagogies is advocating for is an asset-based approach, right? That when writers are entering the workshop space, that they are bringing in ways of knowing, they are bringing in incomes, their own incomes that are situated in culture, that are situated in language and in literacy. They're bringing that into the workshop space, and that can be that is enriching to the workshop, but it's also enriching to our understanding of stories, our understanding of writing, and so that is helping me think more about what it means to teach creative writing and what that workshop space really can be. Culturally sustaining pedagogies also pushes against this notion of the white gaze that Toni Morrison talks about, this idea that that there's a standard to live up to when you are writing. It pushes against that notion. I think about Toni Morrison's words, this idea of as though our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze, right? And so, thinking about an anti-racist creative writing workshop, it's really pushing against the notion of the white gaze. And so culturally sustaining pedagogies takes up that work. So that's been informing a lot of my thinking about what the workshop is and what it can be.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Or yeah, Felicia.
I can't talk about this anti-racist writing workshop without giving props to like my own foundation, which is, as you mentioned in the bio, Young Chicago Authors, which is like a 20-year-old. I came into this nonprofit organization in Chicago, which is just astounding in retrospect that my paths crossed with these folks who taught me how to be a mentor and not just a teacher. And that is a big differentiation for me in my own work and approach to the classroom. But as part of that experience, I had access to the library and I pulled out a copy of June Jordan's Poetry for the People. And it is that book that I feel like, I'm not even I'm just writing the updated version of that book. I mean, she is, she's the foundation there, and that work at UC Berkeley is the foundation there, that movement. And that movement had been happening for years. So although we may be having this conversation now, it's been happening for years. And I think this is maybe an opportunity where folks are ready to just hear. But yeah, I'm a big champion of that, June Jordan.
Thank you. Okay. So making, Matthew, you want to add? Go ahead, please add.
I'm always happy to prop up other stuff. I think Caleb mentioned David Morrow's book, which was a really great surprise for me last year. Then Alexander Cheese, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. I also found, in the research, a bunch of really interesting books that probably wouldn't be called craft books per se, but operated to me the way I wanted a craft book to work. One was a book called Toward the Decolonization of African Literature. I got a lot of Julio Cortázar's literature class, Berkeley 1980. That was a really helpful book. I think we can always go back to Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I found a few other kind of interesting books. Gish Jen's Tiger Writing came into my life at a really interesting time and helped me rethink a lot of things. Thomas King's The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative. He offers a really interesting way of thinking about a narrative steeped in his own cultural experience and ideas. I guess I can stop there, but I feel like the whole panel should be just saying the books
I love
that we learn so much from, right?
I love the synergy of all this and how all of these books are influencing everyone and coming together to bring out really what I think are paradigm shifting ideas. And that's just really fascinating to me. So this is great. And I'm going to be going off and getting a lot of these. David Mura also has a really good YouTube interview with Paul Corrigan. That is really good. Okay, so next question, making the creative writing course radically inclusive, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, can have a ripple effect in the literary landscape, I think. What changes do you think can result from the pedagogies that we're talking about? What do you think is at stake? I know, Caleb, you had wanted to speak to that maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot at stake. But one of the things that comes to mind for me is the literature that is available for people to read in schools, right? You know, creative writing is not just taught in a college setting. It's also taught in high school classrooms, in middle school, right? And so there's I think that there's part of what's at stake is the literature that is available that can speak to the experiences of people, that people can be able to relate to, right? And that can be that they can be able to see themselves in, right? And that they can be able to that can add to their educational experience and learning. I mean, you know, Felicia, on your webpage, I appreciate the bibliography that you provided of all of the just listing you know, writers of color, and I was going through it and just thinking, wow, this is such a rich resource to draw from, especially as I grow in my creative writing. So I think just thinking about the wide range of literature that can be available to people and that can be possible is so important.
Felicia, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I just love hearing the experience of seeing your own voice reflected on the page, right? If that grows, if that comes out as a result of this opportunity, that is success in and of itself. Imagine that someone then sees themselves reflected on the page and says, my voice matters too, right? And so I extend it even farther to participatory democracy. When you feel like your voice truly matters, like your presence is truly reflected in the country that you live in, you're much more willing to participate in that experience. And so I just, you know, my greatest hope beyond, you know, us experiencing empathy when we really take in and receive each other's stories is that we're empowering folks to exercise that voice on a broader scale in this global community that we live in. I know for myself, it took me, and I write about this in the book, it took me 30 years to just say no when I wanted to say no, which, you know, for a Chicana, you know, in my own tradition, growing up in New Mexico, you know, female in my family, that was so hard for me. And it took me, you know, the birth of my first son and this really damaging first year of postpartum depression to finally just turn around and say, no, I can't do everything for everyone and be everything for everyone in this moment. And I, you know, that was post MFA where I'm finally able to exercise my own voice. And so it shouldn't take that long.
Yeah.
For others, that is the early privilege, is access to our own voices. So, you know, on a personal and on a broader political scale, I believe the stakes are so high.
Yeah, I agree. Matthew, you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I could just say, I mean, I think part of the question must be about like the publishing industry and right, and extending it to, right, like we can talk in the classroom, we talk probably endlessly about like making, but part of it is the kind of gatekeeping of whose books get published and whose get publicity and reviews and et cetera, et cetera. And so that has to extend, right, like to people who have the power to make that happen. But I also think, I mean, maybe one of the things I should have said in recognizing other books, I mean, I think literary has been kind of talking about these ideas since the 1950s, and that it's kind of far developed beyond where we are even coming close to starting in creative writing. And that kind of thinking, as you know, for me personally, but also I think for many people, is able to help me to understand kind of the words that, like the power of the words that I'm using and where language comes from and all the symbols that we kind of are steeped in every day. And I think that you know, that has existed on the kind of reading and analytical level and critical level for a long time. And on the making level, I think it's, you know, just equally as important. And if we can kind of bring that all together, we we can just be more aware of like the world that we are living in, but also the world that we're making for ourselves to live in.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and also we're teaching that next generation. So, I mean, yeah, it changes everything. You have something you want to add, Felicia?
Just exactly what you're
Yeah.
saying. I think that I get this question sometimes in these facilitations with teachers is that they're asking, well, I don't know. I'm a white instructor. My classroom, my students are all white. You know, how do we negotiate these? Is it important to touch upon these? And I say it's essential to touch upon an anti-racist workshop model, regardless of what your student population looks like or your personal identity politics, because you are training the next generation of folks who are going to acquire the manuscripts, who are going to approve of the plays, who are going to okay that next article. So it's, for every single one of us, this is essential work, no matter who we work with or where we're located.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Okay. And this might be a good question to end with. So y'all provide a number of different strategies for radically remaking the workshop. For an instructor who is considering these ideas for the first time, what would you suggest are the most important strategies to start with? Felicia, I know you had wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, as I said previously, I think recognizing and coming to terms with the fact that you're already fueling or contributing to a race-based writing workshop. I think people, when they are confronted with this notion of an anti-racist writing workshop, say, oh, I don't have the time or the energy or the resources to put toward an anti-racist writing workshop, when in fact, they are contributing time, resources, energy toward a white supremacist writing workshop, a race-based workshop. So when you come to terms with that neutrality, objectivity, universality doesn't exist on a personal level, stepping back and really taking into consideration your own teaching bias. Ibu Patel has this lovely quote where he talks about standing at the crossroads of inheritance and discovery, and really taking into consideration the way that he was brought up, the way that he was taught. And if we consider it as educators, right, the way that we just like by osmosis are supposed to learn how to teach one another without any like training in actual, in an education department. Many of us just come straight from a PhD or an MFA program straight into the classroom. So we're standing there as educators looking back at the way we were taught. And we're also considering discovery. What other options do we have? Instead of leaning back on tradition, how can we embrace discovery? And that involves surveying our implicit bias, the way it's always been done. What are we bringing to the classroom that we're not even aware of on a personal level? And then working against that tradition to embrace discovery. I think that when we examine our own bias, when we decolonize our own habits, our own ego in the classroom, decenter our own authority, we're better able to focus on listening over speaking and on process over product. So I think it happens inside first. And I also believe that it necessitates an explicit statement to our students that I am advocating for an anti-racist writing workshop, and here is what I am doing in order to achieve that goal. I think the more that we say those words out loud, our students will receive them, and we'll all work toward the same goal.
Great, thank you. Matthew, you want to add to that, and then Caleb. I think I want to hear from everyone on this. So, Matthew.
I just on a personal level, I remember what the first step was for me. It was, other than just like realizing on a personal basis that like it's not going to work the way that it's always worked, or that you've always had workshop. I remember that first year of teaching, just thinking, oh crap.
Recognizing it.
Like this. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it in the classroom as a student, but it's different to know it like as a teacher. But the kind of the first step for me was just I spent like at AWP just asking everybody I could get to answer the question, like how they were teaching their workshops. And the writer Nami Moon said, I teach every workshop differently because every story is different. And that was, like that just kind of blew my mind, even though it's like the most obvious idea ever. But like every workshop I had taken had treated every single piece exactly the same way. And I think that's like, for me, that was the first step, just being able to say like, oh, okay, so let's not do the same thing for every workshop. That is not the way to kind of best serve each writer. That's where I would start.
Thanks. Caleb.
Yeah, I think that seeing students as writers who are bringing in a wide range of assets, a wide range of knowledges, a wide range of histories and experiences and stories into the classroom. I think there's something to be said about reflecting on again the ways in which these deficit frameworks often surround students and students of color, writers of color in particular. And so I think even just looking at how we are seeing students, how we are seeing writers who are coming into the classroom, and everything that they are bringing in, the incomes that they are bringing into the classroom, and into the workshop space, as they look to present their writing, and as they look to grow in their writing and learn from within the community. I think there's something to be said about really thinking about how we are thinking about students as they come into the workshop space.
I love that. I think going from a deficit model to a strengths-based model with the students and thinking about what they are bringing is critical. It's absolutely critical. I think that is a great question to end on, actually. So I'm going to thank you all very much for this groundbreaking hour. This has been wonderful. And I really appreciate the time that you took to share these ideas with us. Please, everyone, go out and get these books. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And also the books that you mentioned. This is a lifelong thing that we can do. And really, it's a journey that we can be on. So as much as, there are first-time strategies, understanding that this is a journey too, that we will be on long-term. And I encourage everyone to think of the students that way as writers, and to realize that we have changes to make. So thank you all for helping us in that. And
Yeah.
Oh, I said thank you. Also, can I add something?
Yes, please.
Because I have had friends and acquaintances who've kind of like tried some of these models as like a experiment, and I think it really does take commitment to the model, and trying it, and then seeing that it doesn't work right away, and then giving up is maybe the biggest danger. And I think, right, like it takes actual, think of all the time you've prepared to teach the workshop model that you've now, right? You've gone through MFA of training and et cetera, and it takes that much commitment, right, to make these models work. And in the end, they work better, I think. But my worry is people will try it once and then think, oh, well, this is not, I'll just go back to the thing I know better.
Right. No, I completely agree. There's sometimes resistance, and we just have to keep trying. Absolutely. Felicia, you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, this was so important to me, Matthew. Like, this was so essential to like my motivation for writing this book. Was like I didn't know how to do it when I started, and I don't think any of us knew, as you were kind of alluding to, that we just had to try something. We had to risk something. something different. And so, essential to my own book is this memoir element of trying to figure out how to evolve something traditional that needed changing, right? And so I see it as like a journey in process. And I talk about my own missteps and my own failures. And I think it's important for those of us who are at the beginning of the journey to recognize, okay, you're not just going to follow A, B, and C off of this list or from this book and get it right? You're going to have to make a series of attempts and individualize it so that it suits you and it suits the community that you're working with. And so, yeah, it's really important that we collate our all of our individual tools, right? So that we can see what best works for all of us and accept that it is a process and it's a learning journey as well for each and every one of us.
Thank you, Felicia. Kayla, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to just affirm that this is an ongoing process. Like when we're thinking about workshop models, it's not like this is the model and then it works, and and now we don't have to think about power and privilege and the dynamics of race and racism that are going on in the workshop space. No, this is an ongoing process. It's thinking about it not just from one semester to the next, but throughout the semester as well, right? Throughout the time that the workshop is meeting, really thinking about how all of this is at play and that this is an ongoing journey.
Absolutely. Thinking of it that way, I think, is critical. And, it gets back to writing itself, which is a journey, which is a lifelong journey. I don't think you ever feel like you've arrived as a writer. Why would you arrive as someone who's trying to teach in an anti-racist way? It's an ongoing process. Okay, well, I appreciate your insights. This has been incredible. And I look forward to reading more of your work. So thank you very much and have a restorative break. Thank you.